Good evening, everybody. My name is Brian Stewart. Welcome. I'll be host of this fall's inaugural series of the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse's Speaker's Corner, which will focus on extraordinary new trends in education. Tonight's topic, back to school in a pandemic. It's so interesting. This historic one-room schoolhouse is still in downtown Toronto. Was sort of begun in the year of Great Revolution, 1848. Yet here we are tonight in the midst of enormous global upheaval as well, a crisis of our own, and certainly in education, in which it's often hard to see the way forward. We know this pandemic has had a major impact, but has it damaged us perhaps even more than we still know, even more than we can grasp at the moment? How badly has that system been damaged? What are the lessons learned? And can we recover in ways that we might just build the system back better? These are three core areas. We'll have many questions, but those are the core ones we keep coming back to. So let me introduce our guests. Charles Pascal, an internationally recognized education scholar who advises governments at home and abroad, is a former Ontario Deputy Minister of Education and at the University of Toronto, a professor of applied psychology and human development at OISE, the Ontario Institute of Education. Sue Winton, professor in the Faculty of Education at York University and very active in the World's Educational Research Association, and her own in-depth research studies look at various factors affecting equity in education, equality. And Annie Kidder is director and founder of the very busy People for Education organization, widely known for its nonpartisan advocacy of and highly influential reports on the power and promise of public education and threats to it. So I'd like to start off tonight with a brief statement from each of you, which will deal with that question. What worries you the most about the damage now being done that we have to turn and repair and build going forward? Annie Kidder, I'd like to start with you first.
It's so hard to pick one thing, but I think the biggest overall worry is one that was already there. It's the cracks that were exposed by the pandemic. I think the good thing is everybody's paying attention now to education in schools because suddenly we realize how important they are. But the worry is that we can really see clearly the inequity in schools. We can really see clearly that the kids who were already struggling have struggled much, much more. Families who were already at a disadvantage have been much more disadvantaged by the pandemic. So the worry and the challenge is how do we ensure that we think about what was already problematic in the system and don't try to I even worry about Build Back Better as if it's going to go back to something like it was before. But how do we go? We have a huge problem in education. I want to put a proviso that we have a very strong public education systems in Canada, but that problem of systemic racism, of inequality has been exposed glaringly by the pandemic. And I think that that's the biggest worry right now.
Sue Winton, how do you see it?
Hi, thank you. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm going to answer your question, really drawing from my current research that I'm doing with Dr. Behan Farhadi. We're looking at the ongoing study of the impact of online and hybrid learning since March 2020. And so without a doubt, the issues that the teachers have picked up have been the ones that Annie already identified, the exacerbated issues of that students face who are already vulnerable going into 2020 and facing systemic inequalities. Certainly, that's something that our teachers keep identifying. But I think one of the things I wanted to talk about, like what's urgent, what's right now, is that they're making the point that they are facing oftentimes pressures from within systems and within government to sort of operate in a sort of business as usual. Yeah. You know, we're back now. We figured this out now. We're in year 2. And I think the message that I'm hearing is like, no, remember, we're still in a pandemic. Slow down. slow down, that there's the children and families, as were mentioned, that are vulnerable, their needs are still not met. Their social needs, their mental, their emotional needs, the message seems to be, let's back off this pressure around academic learning. Not to say that it's not important, but that the critical message I'm feeling is this sense of urgency to say, slow down, and to think about the roles that schools can play in building back, so to speak, or what can they do looking forward. That is less of that can we do now that can help for the academic pieces later. And I think just one piece that came out of the New Zealand earthquakes was the study to show that when schools work with kids to talk about the pandemic or talk about the crisis and bring it in and just have experiences for kids to be able to process what's going on, that pays off in large ways later. So I think
Charles Pascal. Sorry, thank you, Charles Pascal.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian. Great to be here as well. Look, when the pandemic started, what we heard were kind of two phrases. One was, we're all in this together. Well, guess what? As Annie suggested, we've never been all in this together because of the divisive issues regarding issues of poverty and the have-not populations, what some students were getting, what other students weren't getting. The other thing we heard early on in the pandemic is, can't wait to get back to normal. And all of the panelists, we all understand that the notion of normalcy is just not on. Annie and Sue have started to identify lots of the issues that, with the curtain pulled back, we're now able to see issues related to mental health and well-being, issues of racism, issues of homophobia, and all sorts of issues related to learning loss in terms of who was getting what. So you asked Brian a very specific question. What do I worry about the most? I don't worry about what we need to know and what we've learned. I worry about whether there's a political will of a provincial government and provincial governments across this country about whether they will learn and act from what everybody knows needs to be done, and will they put the resources in place to get it done. In Ontario, there's no evidence that it has been the case, and going forward, at least for almost a year, we don't know, because there's no evidence that this government in Ontario will provide the resources. That's what I worry the most about.
Well, on that theme, on that concern, it's kind of as if for the public there's a giant blur out there. Things are happening or not happening, on, off. It just seems to be a kind of swirl of announcements and things that either are announced but not done, done but not announced beforehand, lack of consultation. If you had to prioritize, and maybe this is very unfair to ask this, but if you had to prioritize top action that had to be done absolutely right now, without any further delays, is that too simplistic, or can you think of something that we need to spring into action on? Annie?
Well, we have been calling for now an incredibly long time, it's hard to believe, that the government convene a health and education task force. And I think that then they can start to set priorities. So first of all, what we haven't seen is the necessary collaboration, kind of coherent policy being developed. We're seeing a lot of reactions, sometimes very late, to COVID itself, but not a kind of big picture plan about what have we learned, what do we know, what don't we know, what do we need to learn more about, and how can we learn from people with expertise and people with experience on the ground. So we need everybody at the table, from health and education, parents, deans of education, people like Charles, people like Sue, teachers federations, principals, students for sure, all the support staff. We need people from public health and all the experts. We've had a science table this whole time. We've had a vaccine table, and we amazingly haven't had an education table. So I think that's a first step that would really help with everything else. Any
comments there, Charles?
Well, I totally agree with Annie, and have been supporting Annie's idea for as long as we've been putting it out. Frankly, I would like to see, because there's no evidence whatsoever, the incumbent in the corner office at Queen's Park is going to do that. People have been calling on this diverse task force roundtable for 18 or 20 months now. What I would like to see, the three opposition party leaders basically convene the table and say, you know what, this guy isn't going to do it. So let's have, I don't know why one of the opposition leaders isn't saying, you know what, I want to start behaving like I'm a premier in waiting. Maybe it requires a non-governmental or a foundation or somebody else to do it. But there's the void that Annie has articulated is something that is a first step that should have happened about 15 months ago.
So a provincial or maybe even national crisis meeting on education, Sue?
Well, there have been discussions, and Annie's been a leader in this, and I've written about it as well, that given the kind of federal money that the current federal government has started to put in to try to help with issues of learning and childcare, maybe we've come to a point in time to have a national conversation about learning. And Annie has advocated for this, and so maybe as the best nation builder we can think of, we should try to do something that has a bottom-up, top-down conversation that has a federal or national auspice. But in the short run in Ontario, I totally agree with Annie.
Sue, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I agree that that I agree with Annie's idea, but I hadn't thought so much about the idea of what Charles has raised. And I think it's a good point. Like, what are we waiting for? If we wait for the government, we may be waiting a really long time. There are certainly other people who have the ear of the media and the positions to be able to gather the diverse voices that have already been identified, gather them together and amplify them. Because I would say that, there are lots of sources already from communities, from teacher unions, from researchers, teachers, parents who have a lot to say, but maybe aren't being listened to. So maybe I think that's a really, I think that's a great call to action that we've heard from Charles for some of our other leaders.
To put the pressure on Annie, I'm a nonpartisan as well. It's hard for some people to believe, given my megaphone that I use to criticize. But my nonpartisanship comes from following evidence. But the person who has, I think, the most neutral, nonpartisan convening reputation in Ontario is Annie. And I will send to Annie my version of about 12 to 15 people who could be on something that People for Education could convene. And how that task force behaves will not just be a round table of 12 people, but how they behave in terms of getting all the research and evidence from thousands of people who want to contribute ideas about moving forward.
Is the desire to move forward in it with some kind of emergency meeting that engages all of society, though, blunted to some extent by a kind of fatigue level that might be out there? I'm wondering, from what the three of you are picking up in the trenches, what is the mood amongst teachers, assistants, administrators, parents, government officials? It seems to me tremendous exhaustion must be at play here. Can you get that kind of mobilized spirit in a state with such fatigue? Annie?
Well, I think you can. And I think that, to Sue's point at the beginning, we just had a meeting with principals who were really concerned that nobody understood that it wasn't back to normal, and that principals were already at a level of stress that they're not normally at until December, and that they are concerned that people aren't listening. So I think that you, even though I go, oh God, I already wrote down, I guess maybe we're going to have to do this. But I think that what people wish for inside the system, and also families who are struggling with this, is to be heard. And that there has been an amazing silence in terms of the education part of this on the part of the Ministry of Education. So we've heard about ventilation, which is obviously very important, but we haven't heard about how much we do need to slow down, how much support kids need right now and all the way through this year, how we have to rethink some things. I mean, they've gone ahead with, we're going to introduce new curriculum, we're going to change, there's structural changes being made at the same time as The people working inside the system are working as hard as we can. We're just putting out another report tomorrow from principals talking about all the things that have, that the innovations they've made that they want to continue, but the deep, deep challenge of making schools work in this kind of atmosphere. So I do think I think people desperately want to come together and talk about this.
So Winton, given that it does seem we're in a race against extraordinary mood of stress, of real stress, perhaps you can give me some sense of what it's like out there for parents, for young children, for children really of any age. But I mean, we read about it in a paper, those of us who don't have at the moment a child in school, but it doesn't seem to connect us to the reality of what it's like out there. Could you help?
Well, I mean, if I'm speaking as a parent now, I do have 3 sons. 2 are still in high school. One was in grade 12 in 2020. But I have to say that, as a university professor, the families of the experience of my children are not the experience of many children across the province. They're in a very fortunate position. They have a parent with a secure income who works in education, a former teacher with, lots of technology. Most children don't have that experience. All children deserve the same access to the kinds of opportunities that my kids have had. So I feel that I probably can't speak for many parents, and that's not really where my research has gone. But what I can tell you is that that the teachers that I've talked to, they are concerned about parents who themselves are exhausted. For example, parents, some teachers who have worked with children who have special education needs and other kinds of learning needs, certainly when they, without the kinds of supports that were available in schools, when they've had to go online, those parents, they report of just being exhausted, being very chaotic. So I think that the experience of families varies considerably across the province, depending on where they live, their income, their other kinds of social economic status indicators, who they are, and the kinds of supports that they have available to them.
Charles, what are you picking up in terms of the stress, the mood, the depression?
Well, I think the preamble to your question was, given it's an emergency, it shouldn't have been an emergency. This should be this collaborative notion of tapping the best and brightest right throughout the education system and beyond, with expertise and diversity, as Annie has described it. It shouldn't be an emergency. It should have been part of how we do business to solve difficult social and economic problems. But for better or worse, I'm out there in the media. I'm out there in social media. I've done over 220 for my sins, radio, television, and print interviews. Annie's probably done twice that many. And I'm sick and tired of, hearing my own voice on these kinds of things. Even now, I'm starting to get a little Charles fatigue. But because of all this, I get direct emails and texts constantly from the people we're talking about, from frontline teachers, from superintendents, from parents. And the nature of those outreach, and I still get them, is about wanting to complain about what's going on with them, wanting to discuss, provide ideas about resources they need. So to Annie's point, yes, they're all stressed and they're tired, but you give them a real authentic opportunity to voice their lived experience, and ideas arising that could be creative as part of the problem solving, and they will participate.
Can I add one point, Brian? I just thought about as Charles was speaking, and in relation to that, because I've seen a lot of coverage in the media today, in the last couple of days, around some parents, I believe it's in York Region, who've really taken an active stance around their experiences of their children in the hybrid learning in that school board. So I think that's a really good example of where we do see parents engaging in different kinds of ways, whether it's through formal channels, through like deputations at the board, also through media and so on. So I just wanted to sort of say, like, while yes, I think people are tired, we also are seeing lots of evidence in other places of parents coming out and really working hard for their kids.
that's a really good example of parents basically being proactive. It's a great example, but it should have been avoided. This is what we knew about hybrid learning, how it was implemented, and these Friday afternoon announcements from down on high from this Minister of Education. We know the problems that everybody's having with hybrid learning. My son-in-law is a high school teacher, and I have a direct understanding of what it's like for him. So it's good that the teachers are taking this on, but a lot of this could have been prevented with the right kinds of class size decisions and other things that haven't happened.
Sue, sorry, Annie, to actually get closer to the figures, the numbers, the vision we have to be really worried about. Is there an age group that really worries you the most, that may have been damaged the most in this? Or is it pretty well damaged, scattered throughout the whole system?
That is a really hard question. And I think that what we grown-ups have to remember is that the things that we forget being young often. So we don't take seriously what's been lost or what's been missed. So for all the kids who missed middle school, which just, a massive kind of hormones and adolescent angst, they need that. It's an incredibly important sort of transition period. For kids who didn't get to go to graduation, or kids entering grade 1 who've never known any other kind of school for the last 2 years. 2 years in a kid's life is a very, very long time. So I think even despite all of our stress and anxiety, I think that for young people, we should be paying a lot of attention to what it means to their whole lives. I think some of them, Sue is right, and I just am so happy my children are grown up, but I think for kids who were always good, had, not because they had better parents, even though I'm sure Sue's a fantastic parent, but just for the luck of their birth, resources in their homes, their privilege, access to they lost all their extracurricular activities, but some families who could afford it could still provide those things. So I think for kids, we have to think of all of them. The kids who ended up having their last 2 years of high school with none of the things that create the kind of richness of the school experience. And my worry is that we're going to go, okay, how do we that we're going to actually talk about going back to basics, and we're actually going to narrow our vision for education now and go, we better make sure they're learning their math, which is what we're hearing, as opposed to the exact opposite. We better really pay attention to what all these kids have lost for the last 2 years in terms of relationships, social interactions, learning how to be with other people, learning all the skills and competencies you learn in those interactions by collaborating, by communicating, by taking feedback, things like that. And that's what, it's like we should have a year, maybe more, where we're going, we need to rethink the sort of focus in education so that the kids are all right. And I'm going to use a terrible example. You can just cut me off if I'm going on too long. But I still remember, because I'm incredibly old, going through the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was in grade 4. Nobody talked to me about it. And I thought the world was going to end. And I can still viscerally remember that feeling for, sort of 2 weeks of being terrified. But nobody recognized that a kid would, that this would affect them. So those kids, not only has their school all been messed up, but they've been living in this state where their parents, other people are worried, people are dying. They see governments maybe not, the grown-ups not being as together as they might be. Sorry, that's my rant about, we need to care about young people.
Anyone else want to jump in on that particular subject?
I just wanted to say something that I came across that I didn't know, that I read about in a literature review that my colleague Chloe Brushwood-Rose and graduate student Morgan Bim, they did a lit review recently, published in a public open access journal, a journal of teaching and learning. And they looked at sort of what's been the evidence around the impacts of disaster on children. And one of the things that they found in their review was that, children who are not even yet school age have been found to have impacts on, in the longer term of the disaster. So it's sort of going to Annie's point. So it's not just the kids who are currently in school, but also children who are not yet in school can, they also may have impacts going forward. So I thought that was something worth bringing up, as well as the teachers that I told you in my research. I talked to secondary school teachers, and I think one of the things that they groups of students that they really flagged were kids that sort of disappeared and never came back, or that they lost track of in 2020, and don't really know what happened to them. And again, in this lit review, I learned that that's not that uncommon. And in particular, students who are from lower income backgrounds are the ones more likely to not return to school.
Charles, I mean, not just the younger children, I'm thinking now of teenagers and the rest, but thought they had a life ahead of them or a future ahead of them, suddenly thrown into this miasma of doubt and uncertainty. What kind of effect can that have?
Well, I think I think Annie and Sue have responded quite well to the issue of all the different kinds of things that are part of the context of individual students. The younger ones, Annie makes a good point that the number of hours and months and years they've lived as a fraction of the total, has potentially a larger impact. But I got a call about a month and a half ago from a parent who was trying to make some choices. I don't know this person. She knew somebody who knew somebody, and so she called me, and she was under a huge amount of stress, and you could listen to it and feel it. And my advice to parents regarding kids of all ages is kids pick up the stress from their parents. Yeah. And so the importance of mindfulness and meditation and dealing with the mental health and well-being of those who are in the child's life. When the mask comes down in an airplane, if everybody remembers when you flew in airplanes, the flight attendant says, affix the mask to yourself, breathe normally. I like that one because I want to reserve the right to hyperventilate if the mask comes down, but then attend to a child or somebody else. And that's what parents of kids of all ages, teenagers, preschoolers, those around the kids, if they're calm and if they can explain what's going on in a way that it's not easy, but to explain to kids what's going on, to be honest with them, but honest in a way that isn't going to raise the stress. So we all need to just take it down a notch when we're dealing with kids.
When we look, we are in a way where we are, unfortunately, and in many ways it's a mess. In many ways it needs a major emergency meeting of citizens to come together, perhaps. But is there a way of looking at this experience as also one in which we learned a lot of lessons that might be useful in the future? There is a recovery that's possible that can come out of this, that can perhaps maybe have an influence on a whole generation of students and parents going forward to the better.
I think Brian and Annie alluded to this before. The things about mental health and well-being, the things about differentiated success in learning, issues regarding whether you got help if you were falling behind. Rich folks can hire a tutor. Poor folks can't. All the things that need to be part of a whole new way of looking at things. A lot of these things were known well before the pandemic by people like Annie. And the best part about the pandemic is it's raised the level of literacy of the population at large that elects governments that's more literate right now about what needs to happen going forward. Look at childcare, for example. The pandemic has called attention to the critical importance, social, emotional, and economic benefits of high quality, not-for-profit childcare. And now, there seems to be support across the nation that we haven't seen. And all of this is a result of all the things that were required for people with kids to be able to think about going back to work. A lot of discrimination and divide regarding how this affects women, et cetera. More people know about that, and that's a good thing.
Sue,
Yeah,
Looking at things that we may build upon from this and say that we learned a good deal here.
Definitely. So about 20, I believe it was 18, the last election, Ontario election, I was teaching a course and, or maybe it was just afterward. Oh, it was just afterwards, sorry, 2019. And at that time, the government had announced that they were going to be introducing 4 online, requiring high school students to take 4 courses online. And at the time there, I was scrambling with my students. I'm like, let's take a look at this issue. What does the research say? And I think that what we found was there really wasn't a lot of research on the online learning for for high school level students. It was predominantly in the higher education sector. So I think there were certainly there was information available and people were throwing up cautions. Like I said, Dr. Farhadi had her doctoral work looked at online learning because it certainly wasn't already in place. But I think to get to my point, I think we know a lot more about online learning. We know about some of the benefits. In particular, we have a better sense of who it benefits. So, there are some that were that before it was benefiting people who were most advantaged. They were taking it as a way to be able to free up some time to pursue other things that might secure them some advantages in getting into high schools. We know more about who it doesn't always benefit or who struggles a lot with online learning. And again, these were things that was present, but now we can know a lot. We know a lot more about research. We know about it in our own context.
But yeah, if I may, Brian, with all due respect, Sue, the issue wasn't online learning and what we knew about it and didn't know about it. It was the manner in which the minister introduced it in a top-down, mandatory way without any consultation with the kinds of things that you're talking about. So this is a proxy for how this Minister of Education has done with just about everything. So you're right about what we can learn. You're right about the capacity of folks how to use it. But we need to look at how we did it. We also need to look at what the obvious motive was. And the motive was to save money and basically eventually to privatize independent learning. Which was made explicit down the road with a little bit of a slip of the tongue by too many people around the minister. So you're right about all the research about how it could work over time, but he did a top-down, we're getting this done, and it's going to be done, next Tuesday.
And
yeah.
Sorry, Sue, you wanted to reply to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, no, I wanted to agree with that. I wanted to just also on the piece around privatization, I think that one of the things that, because I do a lot of research around the issue of privatization. And one of the things that I think that in relation to online learning is the idea that how people have used people with advantages have used online learning as a way to further benefit their own private interests through the public system. And that is one component of privatization. There are certainly others of which the choice of online learning is one in the kind of a marketplace of privatization. So I just wanted to, I agree with you, Charles. This is opened up a whole lot of issues. I guess I was just trying to put some positives because we've also learned about who online learning doesn't work for. And I think that actually is going to hopefully be important when the issue is revisited around online learning post-pandemic and the considerations for whether it be mandated or not. Or
I want to spend some more time on the at least potential positive. I'm not saying they're here now, but Annie, in one of your reports recently, what worked and what didn't, was absolutely fascinating. Some of the things, and mind you, the negatives far outweigh them, where the online parent-teacher interviews were improved during this period. School council meetings could be more efficient or brought together. There was an increase in participation by staff and families, new innovative field trips. So there were things that a local school could get into, perhaps, that should not be junked when we go back. We're not going to go back to the same old world we were in 2017 or 18.
Well, no, and I think it is really important that teachers were able to collaborate online also, because it's, you didn't have to, You know, you could wear sweatpants for one thing. You didn't have to go anywhere to do it. And kids could. They went on field trips far away that they never would have been able to access before. Teachers had professional development from people that they could have with them in real time while they were teaching that would have been harder to make happen the other way. And some of those things, so it's the, you know, the mat, here we are talking to each other and we're not all in a room together. I've been, you know, part of conferences in Dubai in the last 2 years that I never would have been able to go to. So it has opened up doors, I think, and schools have a tendency to be a bit closed off. So the technology has helped in that way. And I think that, you know, the principals definitely talked about a level of stress that they thought was unmanageable. But they also said that, so they talked about how much all the staff rose to the occasion, how much teachers learned frantically how to operate all this technology, how to make it work, and how to try to make it work for kids. And I think that those are some of the things that we have to ensure that we don't throw out. And I think the other, I mean, this is a weird thing but I think it is amazing, and maybe that's what you were pointing to, Charles, how much the general public knows about and talks about education and cares about it, suddenly sees this is this incredibly important public asset that we have, that once you didn't have kids in school anymore or weren't working in education, there was I used to think that when people, you know, asked me what I did at a party, that they, when they'd heard it, they would go, oh God, I hope I don't get stuck talking to her all night because it sounded so boring. But now nobody thinks it's boring anymore. And I think that's really important, and they're recognizing, you know, how important it is to all of us that we take care of this thing.
Charles,
Brian, can I mention something that has received some attention, but needs far more attention because of the pandemic and because of the weather. People talked about, let's do more learning outside. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? There's the potential for a major evolution and eventually revolution. And we need to learn, you know, we're always, you know, there's a lot of talk about the importance of indigenous issues and indigenous peoples. We need to take a lesson from the land-based learning experience of indigenous leaders and turn the outside into a classroom. There's not one subject on earth that can't be taught effectively with getting exercise and fresh air. And I'm talking year round. And even in urban settings, that's different from rural and suburban, there's a host of things that the outside world can offer. And this is something that it's a kind of an unintended thing because we gotta have ventilation, and there's no better ventilation than being outside. So we need to look at land-based learning from an indigenous framework.
I should just add, on the 20th, we have a whole new session on the outdoor school. So we're going to be talking, in fact, about the outdoor school.
There's been an outdoor education movement in Canada for about 25 years. Right. So there's a lot of expertise about how this kind of approach to learning can be implemented.
Sue, what worries you about that online world that we're also looking at? I mean, we're all affected maybe by watching the congressional hearings yesterday with the Facebook personality. Right. But I mean, what worries you in the way that, yes, they've been very useful. We've done marvelous things, but we have to be terribly careful now going forward in that area.
Yeah, I think that, you know, starting to hint at that, but if I think I'd like, this is something that I'm very worried about, is the relationship between online learning and education privatization. So as I mentioned before, and as Charles alluded to, you know, privatization takes many forms, but I think it's sort of one of the general ways of thinking about it is when a private sector takes on responsibilities that were formerly of the public sector. And I think that we've seen, so there's been a lot of interest in and companies and some very wealthy individuals and philanthropists around the world pre-pandemic to introduce online learning as a means. It's considered a $3 billion industry or something that yet to be untapped. And so there's various motivations, but one of the things that concerns me a lot is that there'll be greater involvement of the private sector. We've had to rely on a lot of things like online platforms that are collecting data about ourselves and our kids that we don't know where it goes or how it's used. That worries me. We just don't know. So I think that's one element. A second element is this, privatization also looks like adopting reconfiguring the public system to be more like the private sector and competition and setting kids up against each other. And again, online learning has been one more choice or option that has been offered in a lot of marketplaces that offers advantages to the already advantaged. And then also, one of the things, as I mentioned before, just how online learning, is used strategically as yet another way for students with advantage to accrue more advantages within the public system that they can then take, and look to university, be more competitive in getting into universities, and then more competitive for scholarships. And so those are, there are certainly other ones, eye strain, physical health, those kinds of things. But I think I'll stop there for now.
But I want to add, can I just add to Sue's, so we just looked at all of the policies across Canada, and we're just going to keep following them. And Ontario is one of the few provinces or territories that made it a choice. So in most other places, most other provinces and territories, it's only if you medically cannot go to school that online learning is a choice. So yes, it kicks in right away. If you've got an outbreak in Northwest Territories right now, everybody's learning online again. PEI has a bunch of schools online. But Ontario decided that even without the pandemic, as a kind of permanent choice, so this is for elementary school kids too, that online learning was a choice. And that separation, and I think Sue's really right to be worried about that. There are lots of great things that can happen in online learning, but dividing the system the way that we have done now in Ontario was a huge step that happened kind of under the cover of the pandemic, and we're stuck with it now, and that is a worrying part of it.
Yeah, what I love Annie's generosity of spirit. The notion that it's a choice was something that was a response, a very loud response from parents and teachers and educators to what the government's intentions were. So did Ontario back off and offer that choice? Yes, but they had to back off that choice. That wasn't something that was part of it. But look, Noam Chomsky said that if you want to start paying attention to who the privatizers are, the first thing they do is they starve the system. They cause chaos. They reduce choices. And that foments an increase that people will accept private options. So Annie has heard me say this before. I don't mind saying it one more time. And that is either this government, when it comes to publicly funded education, is the most incompetent in terms of how they go about it, or it's very clever and it has an ideological end game to introduce more privatization. With respect to what Sue has said about online learning, look, I prefer the phrase remote learning, but when remote learning, one of the problems with university professors that I hang out with and others is they think that taking their content and putting it through the technological black box and out comes the same regurgitation. And what we need are instructional systems designers who understand that learning is about individual differences, the ability to practice what you're learning through problem solving, the ability to have breakout groups where you can meet with peers. You can replicate all the things that happen in a real classroom with sophisticated instructional systems design people. I've got about a half a dozen at OISE who are the best in the world. So when it's done poorly, we should be worried about it. And when it's done with fancy marketing shortcut stuff, which Sue has rightly reinforced, and it's something that a particular government that might be in Ontario is susceptible for, we'll see. You know, the Independent Learning Center at TVO has been around for what, about 50, 60 years, Annie? So
more.
there's, yeah, or more. What's going on with that? Is that going to be privatized, or what's going to happen with respect to making sure that becomes a far more effective entity? So Sue's right to raise those red flags, but there's a lot of good things that can be done under a public auspice that can turn it into something useful for all kids.
Yeah, I actually wanted to say that one of the things that have been a positive that we might take with us is this very point. I think there's been some very good discussions about what is good online pedagogy. I think people have a much better sense, the educators do, whether they are K-12 or even a lot of the colleagues I work with. You know, we're paying attention, we're realizing that first of all, we have also learned that it's not cheaper to do it well, which I think is an important lesson, but also just what are those differences? So I think that is something really positive that we can take forward. And what are the things that are just not workable if they exist, or what needs to be in place so that they can be workable. And I just wanted to also raise that as the point about questions around assessment have also been ones that I've heard a lot of teachers talk about, and I can say in higher education we've talked about as well, like what are we assessing, why are we assessing it, and those kinds of conversations, sort of this questioning of some practices that were sort of taken for granted. I think that's those are some other positives as well that this situation has enabled.
I want to move on to other areas, but just a reminder first that there will be question period near the end of our session, and you can, if you have a question, put it into the little chat box that you'll see at the bottom of the screen. So I'll be coming to that in a while. I wanted to move on to, well, before I do, I'm haunted by has come up several times, and that is the equality, the inequality situation that might be developing in a crisis. We still don't know the extent of how a system that absolutely has to fight against inequality may have been taking more on simply because this is what the crisis has left us with. And perhaps we haven't acted, as Charles would suggest, anywhere near as effectively or aggressively as we should have. Inequality, is that more of a worry now than, say, 2 years ago in our system? Annie?
Yeah, yes, I think so. So, I mean, the UN or UNESCO at one point raised the kind of specter of a generational catastrophe. And what they meant, and it's less so in a privileged country like Canada, but that did have to do with that inequality. So it is important that we know it's been there for, you know, for a very long time anyway, that still, no matter what systems have done, I worry that we're making it all sound totally terrible. There are amazing things happening in schools, but the, you know, socioeconomics, demographics, race are still the biggest predictors, were before the pandemic and are even more so now during the pandemic. And I think that you know, what many people have been saying up to now is we're focusing on the wrong things. We're not working on the right stuff in order to change that, to move that equity needle. We think we have the wrong needle as part of the problem. But so that what's happened in the pandemic, because it came down to what's the kind of bare bones, is suddenly it exposed the fact that for some kids, if you don't have all of the sort of wraparound support of schools, they don't have any of those things there. So it reinforces the work schools can do. It's definitely left kids behind. Sue's really right. There are definitely high school students who normally you would find in the hall and go, hey, what's happening? Why aren't you in class? Come on, let's talk about it. You know, that there's that kind of stuff that goes on. So it is a worry about who's been lost in this time. And we have to focus on that. But to me, the potential there is to actually shift what we're focusing on anyway, that inequity was a problem before the pandemic. And part of the reason it was a problem was we just kept doing the same thing, expecting a different result, the definition of insanity. And we weren't shifting the way we assess. We weren't focusing on different kinds of skills and competencies that start to be built in early childhood education and should continue to be focused on all the way through school, so that kids, my kids, Charles's kids, yours, Sue's, are at an incredible advantage because they get all that enrichment outside of school. They get talked to more because their parents aren't under so much stress. So the system needed to evolve anyway. Before the pandemic, everybody was saying the world is changing very, very fast. The school system is not changing. And now that we've had the pandemic, which has shone a light on this, again, it's the opportunity of a crisis to go, okay, we can't pretend we don't know this. It's too many negatives. We have to do something about it.
Well, we obviously have an enormous number of clear-eyed thinkers in this area. Why are we, Charles, you've already answered some of this, but why are we so sluggish going forward? I mean, inequality, Sue, has been a concern of yours for years now. Are we actually making any progress?
Well,
sorry, Charles.
Yeah, Charles, I wasn't sure who you were asking. Why don't you go ahead first, Charles?
Yeah, well, look, inequality has been a preoccupation with me since I was 12 years old through sports. And what I noticed with respect to teams with different quality of uniforms and equipment and skin color and so these kinds of things. And so it's through my grandfather and me asking some naive questions. Inequality is the biggest problem the globe has. The have-not situation is entrenched. And why isn't there action? There isn't action because there aren't enough people who understand that it's in their enlightened self-interest, those with wealth and privilege, it's in their enlightened, if they don't want to do it just because it's the right thing to do, to ensure that there's equity regarding the distribution of public resources, the principle of enlightened self-interest. You want to live in the future in a gated community, the materials of which have yet to be invented by metallurgical engineers. So as Annie and Sue and Brian, you have pointed out, more and more people understand that gap. But you know what? There's a whole bunch of major issues, in the public domain. The 215 kids near Kamloops in unmarked graves. A big push from Canadians and tears right across the country. And how has that been sustained regarding the nature of a real push? So we've got a major issue, and it's about leadership, and it's about leadership of people with privilege, basically listening and learning from those with lived experience other than their own. There are no magic bullets, but it requires what anybody can do that has the position to do something radically different. And I must say, look, anything that happens regarding the anti-kidder task force has to begin with asking a very clear question. What is the purpose of publicly funded education? You got to start by being really clear. What is it about? Well, for me, my mantra is real clear. Publicly funded education is potentially the best enabler of a future, which needs to be healthier, safer, more just and prosperous for the many rather than the elite few. There's values embedded in that, but that's my clarity. That's my mantra, and it's been with me for a long time. But there has to be a collective ownership of what is the purpose of education. People for Education has been doing some great things about thinking outside the box. But this is the moment, the next couple years. This is going to take 5 years to get something. And I go back to my big worry, is there political will that will come down the pike sometime soon? Or will education continue to be a political football where every single successive government basically has to reinvent and put their stamp on it. We need to think about alternative structures that become nonpartisan, that go across political stripes of any kind. And there are different models around the world.
And so, Winton, we're really talking not just about Ontario, of course, but we're talking about governments all over the globe. They seem to be having, many of them, great many of them, having the same problem. They see a vision, they know they should be working towards it, and nothing much happens year after year after year. Well, is that what you're finding?
Yeah, well, I think that there's some other larger ideas at play that also that come to bear to influence the situation around inequity. I think one of the myth of meritocracy is alive and well and across our province, this idea that people who have advantage, they somehow deserve it. They've worked hard. And so, of course, the flip side, which people don't like to acknowledge as much with the meritocracy side, is, well, I guess those who don't deserve it or didn't earn it. So I think that myth, which has been, there's lots of evidence to show that it really is a myth. It's something, nevertheless, I think a lot of people hold on to. It's oftentimes people who are the benefactors of that myth. I think there's the policy choices that have been made, again, by governments, yes, ours and around the world as well, to sort of if you're concerned about equity, then you just as an individual make a different choice, as opposed to having governments take responsibilities for ensuring equity. So for example, I don't think it's the right place to put on a parent and say, well, you have two good options. One will be more equitable, but one will give your kid an advantage. I don't think that choice should be put to parents. I think that's something that is a responsibility of governments. But so I think that's another reason why people are faced sort of with this sort of equity conundrum. So I think that responsibility but it's part and parcel of this whole idea about who's responsible for outcomes. And so, yeah, I think that there's research, it's not mine, but there's a great book that's called The Spirit Level, where the authors pulled together research around the world that shows, as Charles said, that it's in everybody's better interest to have a more equal society, from a health standpoint, safety standpoint, trust, and even from an educational outcome standpoint. Mm-hmm. The countries that have less social inequality, which may be too many negatives, sort of, they do better on all kinds of indicators. So it actually is in everyone's interest, although I don't think that when you put it right to an individual level, they're not always able to see that how their individual choice is actually impacting everyone else, including themselves.
Yeah, Brian,
I want to go to global issues.
Just an additional comment about the spirit level.
Sure.
So the basis of the spirit level is, if you look at countries that have a low GDP, but have an equitable basis for decision, compared to wealthy countries with high GDP, the health outcomes, social outcomes are better with the lower GDP with the equity. The countries like Denmark and so on and so forth.
Well, certainly the polls done year after year after year for decades on the happiness scale of societies, Scandinavia always seems to come in well ahead still, and countries sort of like that put a lot of emphasis on health and education, what have you. I think it's a good time to go to a question now. So Mariah Bao is handling our questions, a tech person. Could you bring one up, please?
Yes, we do have a couple of questions, and I'll remind listeners, feel free to submit in the chat as we go through them. But the first question is, aside from manufacturing, warehouses, and construction sites, most COVID outbreaks in this fourth wave are happening in schools. Is enough being done to protect children's health?
No. There should be mandatory vaccines for kids 12 and up and for all staff. And I think that that's the number one action that, for whatever reason, no government across Canada has been willing to take, but though it does seem to be slowly happening. But the way to protect young kids and everybody is to ensure that everybody else is vaccinated. So the reticence about vaccination has been insane. We have in Ontario an Immunization of School Pupils Act. It has a list of diseases in it that we add to regularly as vaccinations come on, into supply. And it is, measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, HPV, whooping cough. And it would be simple, I think. We can ask Charles, he used to be a deputy minister, to add COVID-19 to that list and say, okay, you can't go to school unless you're vaccinated. And as vaccinations become available for younger kids, we can make it for whatever age they're available to. But it is, in the name of choice, back to Sue's point, there's a lot of people who have a right to choose what they do. Well, and I am not being partisan here, and God knows our prime minister has made many, many mistakes. But today, when they definitively said you can't work for the federal government unless you're vaccinated, and if you're not vaccinated, you're going to lose your job. Yeah. It just is a plain truth now about COVID because it's with us now. So sorry, I feel very ranty about this particular issue to do with schools because there's something we could do about it, and it's not that hard.
The only thing I would add to Annie's perfect response is when people argue against mandatory vaccination, they talk about human rights and privacy. Well, the Charter of Rights, every constitutional lawyer in the country has said that the Charter of Rights does not give people the right to harm others. The reason we're not able to smoke anywhere we want is because of the evidence regarding secondhand smoke harming others. So when people have lost the right to smoke anywhere they want, that's the issue. So,
and the Ontario Human Rights Commission came out and said specifically, we're not going to protect you this way. You have to get vaccinated. That this is not a charter issue. It's not you can't come to us claiming that your rights are being violated. So, it really is. This is a political issue. We've been doing this work looking at policies across the country in all different ways. And when I first did the scan, I felt like I was insane because I kept going, how can these provinces be going, nope, nobody has to wear masks anymore. Nobody has to do anything. Now they've all gone back. But it made me feel crazy because I kept thinking, I'm reading the newspaper and I feel like this is a bad idea. Anyway,
to quote the premier of this province, when he announced what he was going to do the week before last, I really don't want to do this. I don't think it's the right thing to do, but I'm going to do it. Well, that very clever, eloquent intro, I think it's almost verbatim, was designed to appeal to his red meat core who don't like vaccinations. And so there we are, always lagging behind the evidence to suggest what to do.
Sue, do you have something to add to that?
I don't think I have anything to add. I just, just as Annie was talking about the requirements, I was reminded of how, I mean, maybe I'm not the best parent I could be, because a couple of times I got notices from my kids' school that would say, oh, your child's behind on such and such vaccines and they better get them done before, or they won't be able to return to school. So I just want to put it out there that there is that system in place and it does operate. And guess what? My kids went and got those vaccines. So,
Mariah, another question?
Yeah, so this is kind of in a similar vein, so it might have a similar answer, but is the government's new program to deploy rapid testing in hotspot school zones enough to stop school closures?
Well, I think Charles and I might not agree about this. So I have been looking at this really a lot. I'm so tired of, and I'm not an expert in any of this, but let me tell you, I've learned a lot about it. I actually think that we're going to have to be really, really careful with, I could be totally wrong too, so Charles, you can argue with me, with everybody's desire to feel better. So it's like I could go get tested every day and know I don't have COVID every single day. But I think, and I don't often totally agree with things that are happening sometimes from this government, but I think that we have to be a little bit practical about deploying rapid testing. And to me, it does make some sense to say we are going to get those rapid tests to places where there there is more spread happening, so that families will have access to them, and we'll deploy them there. It's been really interesting, again, looking at other provinces. In Nova Scotia, they're getting them to every single family of every kid who's 11 or younger. Saskatchewan's doing something more like that too. In Quebec, the testing's only happening inside school classrooms, so parents have to give permission for the kids to get tested, and they're only testing symptomatic kids in a classroom. But I think that we have to be careful of saying everybody has, it's another right maybe, to have rapid testing all the time so that I'm, able to test my kids every couple of days. I think this is a good start, maybe, which is getting them to the places like in Hamilton right now, where there's a high need, other places where the numbers are going up. Charles, you go ahead.
No, I'm always, the license plate proxy is always there in the back of my mind regarding implementation is everything. So I worry a little bit about implementation, even-handedness, who will it affect in terms of being able to do it well. And also, I don't have a big disagreement, other than the fact that rapid tests have a certain percentage of, negative positives and positive negatives, and it's not perfect. But I don't have it a major. It's not something I'm going to rant and rave about.
So you going to rant and rave at all?
No, I don't think I'm going to rant and rave.
Okay.
I don't know too much about the announcement from today.
Mariah, let's have another question, please.
The next question is about the controversy of hybrid teaching, hybrid method. Does it hurt the kids in class or the ones learning from home more?
Depends on the kid.
Depends on the kid. Kitty, get her.
Well, I'm going to start, but I think Sue knows more about this than me.
Sorry, Sue.
I think that one of the things that I do know is that when people look at this from an operational perspective, they go, great, we can afford this. We can't afford to, because the government decided, everybody had a choice about whether or not to go to school online or not, a decision they did not have to make. And then boards were left with supplying teachers to those kids learning online, because every parent was allowed to choose that. And they didn't have enough money to do that, so that they were stuck with having to supply one teacher when half the kids are learning online and half the kids are in real life. So when you talk to operational people in boards, they went, this is great, it works really well, it saves money, it's very practical. But when you talk to the education people in boards, and these are leaders of boards too, they went, but we know educationally it's terrible. And I don't think anybody, and go for it, Sue, is arguing that from an educational perspective, it's good for either group, the kid learning online or the kid in the classroom.
I want Sue to comment on my scientific experiment. I'm not going to submit this for publication, Sue, unless I run it by you. But I have two granddaughters, and one of them thrives on the online learning, and one of them suffers terribly. So there you go, scientific sample.
I mean, I don't have much to add from what I know from research. I certainly can't say who suffers more. I mean, I think that the experience of people fully online is, children fully online is a different experience than children who are virtual as part of a hybrid classroom arrangement. But like Annie, I've heard mostly from teachers who've been asked to do this kind of work, and they say it's unworkable. Somebody said to me, a teacher said the other day, they're just waiting to be told they have to do it on roller skates too. Like, it's just because it's just, it's so crazy. And I mean, I see a lot of my students who are, doctoral students who are also teachers. They just anecdotally, they'll say like, I can't get any work done. I'm absolutely exhausted. And I think that point has already come up a number of times tonight, that our teachers are working so hard and they're exhausted and they're burnt out, and there's reports saying people are thinking of leaving the profession. And so I think that whether we can say who benefits more or less from hybrid learning, I'm not confident that anyone's really benefiting very much at all.
Mariah, another question.
Sorry.
Mariah?
So this is the last question in the chat, which is, we often hear about mental health concerns among students, but what is actually being done?
Good question. Well,
Charles, do you want to start?
Go for it, Charles.
Nothing's being done. I mean, the gaps and cracks from the youngest of our young in preschool right throughout elementary, secondary, and post-secondary regarding the epidemic of mental health issues is simply a crisis of major proportion. It was before the pandemic, it's been exacerbated. So the notion of early identification, early raising question marks, having teachers and educators trained to be able to begin to say, maybe there's something here, to have the resources for diagnostics and a back on track wraparound assistant to help and support kids. We need a preschool through elementary, secondary, and university mental health and well-being system. Where Sue and I work at the post-secondary level, the number of students who basically drop out in the first semester of their first year is enormous. And suicides, undetected learning disabilities, and other mental health and well-being issues that were never diagnosed, and all of a sudden they're facing midterm exams. And in some universities, and I won't name them, basically the medical model comes in and kids are given medicine to keep the lid on, at least till November 1st, because that's when the province counts the number of students that are in a university for purposes of giving grants. So it is a huge problem, and we need to build the capacity of educators in the TDSB, the largest school board in Canada. When a previous political cousin of the current premier was in office, they basically defunded the TDSB to such an extent that all of the diagnostics, all the psychometricians, all the psychologists were gone, and they haven't been put back. So it's a major problem and requires a systems thinking approach. And again, those with resources, like my youngest daughter, a question mark was raised about a learning disability from her third grade teacher, who's not an expert. She mentioned it to me when I picked my daughter up. I got defensive as a father. I said, no, she's fine. Teacher just said, just pay attention. And after 2 or 3 weeks, I realized there was a problem between what she was saying and expressing and what she was able to communicate in writing. The diagnostics were done by the former TDSB psychologist who is now doing private stuff. I paid $1,500 for the diagnostics. A grade principal and vice principal and teachers put together a wraparound system to put her back on track. And the rest is history in terms of what she's become. So Rolodex and money should not be, and I'm embarrassed to tell the story, should not drive whether somebody gets that kind of help that my youngest daughter got.
Sue Winton, did you have something to say to that? Sorry. Sue?
No, I just want to say that I agree from what I've heard from, I'm not aware of any big, a lot of investments beyond, there was some investments in the kids' help phone at one point, like a year or so ago. But the teachers that we spoke to were saying, we're bringing this up saying, look, everybody is talking about mental health needs of our students. And yet this is where they bring up, yet we're not given the space or the training or just the opportunity to address the mental health needs and to back off. It's sort of like business as usual, and is the message, and that it's very troubling for teachers.
And one of your reports actually mentions that mental health and education support have really been impaired enormously during this period. And there's a shortage of social workers, psychologists, child youth counselors, so many shortages in a system that really needs now to be handling many crises, including perhaps the mental health one.
Well, and I think there's two parts to this, and one is the, looking forward. Yeah, there aren't enough supports there. Principals and teachers, support staff are really trying, and there's just not enough resources or time or breathing room or space. This again goes back to the slowing down. But there's another longer term piece in this, which in our organization we've been talking about for years, which really has to do with, because I worry sometimes when we talk about mental health, really we mean mental illness. So that's one thing. But how are we changing how we teach and what we teach so that we are building the skills, the resources, the competencies in kids, which they learn way more of in early childhood than they do once they're in school, to understand themselves, to understand their own feelings, to be able to understand how they think, how they learn, so that they're not ending up with mental illness later on. And I'm not saying it would cure all mental illness, but the curriculum itself needs to change. We need to see this as teachable, learnable things that schools need to be responsible. Schools shouldn't be responsible for curing mental illness or diagnosing mental illness. But if we changed what we thought of, back to Charles's the purpose of education, which some have described as becoming a capable human being, being able to take care of your own mental health is a core function of being human. And that's the long-term change that's needed in schools.
And one of the things, Brian, that Annie's reminded me of, I'm surprised I need to be reminded of it, the full day kindergarten, the preschool curriculum that has been invented in Ontario was a unique contribution to ensuring that resilience was part of the social and emotional aspect of what it's like to do those things. The problem is, in some schools, there's been some great elementary school principals who realized, gee, when those kids go from, go into first grade, we have to continue doing so. We have to continue giving them a kind of a booster shot and reinforce the things that they were beginning to develop in kindergarten throughout the system. And Annie is absolutely correct. All the things we learned in kindergarten, as the poem goes, we need to carry through.
Sue, you alluded to earlier the burnout factor you all have to some extent, but you alluded to the burnout factor among teachers. Is it possible, a bit like the medical health system area, that front line, that we could start seeing a lot of people leaving the profession? Is it possible that
I think it's,
face a crisis? Next, the crisis could be the lack of teachers.
Yes, absolutely. I think that we saw last year their school boards having a very difficult time trying to get any kind of supply teachers. The government introduced short-term measures that allowed teacher candidates, so students who had not yet graduated from faculties of education teacher training programs, that they were able to get an emergency certification that was good for about 6 months. And people felt that was likely because they were trying to address the shortage and the desperate need for substitute teachers. I have read other reports that done by other organizations where teachers say they think about leaving or that they have left. So absolutely, I think it's a very big concern. And I think that related to that is, so we may have a teacher shortage or challenges, certainly probably in some areas more than others, but we also have teacher candidates, students across the teacher who will be teachers who some of them will have very little classroom experience, in-person experience. At this point, they still must have some in-person to be certified by the College of Teachers, but that may change depending on how the next little while unfolds. And so there will be some who have had predominantly online experience and very little in class. So I think the whole issue around teachers and what the teaching workforce is going to look like is something that we absolutely need to be paying attention to.
We don't have too much time left, actually. We're about the last question, but I would like to bring it back to a kind of global issue that has concerned me, that concerns me a lot when I travel. I just want a sense of how Canada, all the provinces together in education, are actually doing internationally in education. I mean, should we as a nation be hearing alarm bells going that we're not progressing as far as fast as we should be for a country our size and wealth, but also that progress has been made much more difficult now thanks to the crisis that we've been living in and are still in.
I think that, okay, go Charles.
Well, the first thing is Canada does not have a national educational entity. So there is
no
no
such
such
thing. Of course. But I mean, if you add it all, look at it
no,
as a
but,
nation together.
But yeah, but up until, you know, if you look at some of the international indicators, Ontario was performing, and I take some of those international scores and tests with a grain of salt, but they do have some credibility regarding how Canada is perceived. Ontario was, you know, leading the English-speaking world behind Singapore and Finland for a while regarding the nature of performance. Alberta has done well, so you have to look at province by province. And this is one of the reasons, Brian, that I think there should be a national conversation about learning, a Canadian preoccupation with answering your question.
And I want to add that, you know, Charles is right. So we have to watch, you know, what proxy measure are we using to say, is Canada doing well or not? And by the proxy measures we have, scores in reading, writing, and math and science, Canada is doing really well. We're doing fine in those areas. I think the thing that's being brought up, sometimes this is seen as, you know, whatever, blasphemous, but we do have to think about the kinds of jobs kids are going to have. We do have to think about the kind of modern economy that I know education isn't all about getting jobs, but it partly is. And so where people are worried about Canada's competitiveness is actually has to do with what everybody should be thinking about education. So are we, you know, again, back to the rapidly changing world and the fact that, you know, kids are going to have a million different kinds of jobs, and it's not that they need to learn one skill. They need to be able to keep on learning. They need to be able to, you know, apply what they've learned in one area to a different one. They need to be able to collaborate, all the things we hear about those things, but we're not actually changing our school system. So we have all the sort of big employers and that kind of voice saying we need young people who can solve complex problems, that can you know, take an idea, work on it, look at it critically, come back with a new idea, who can persist, who can, and those are the things that right now we see as kind of extras in schools. So maybe on Friday afternoon we'll do that, as opposed to embedding it in the curriculum. So in the narrow measure, Canada's education system does really, really well, but it has to evolve.
If I might quickly, Brian, you know, I always look for inspiration regarding folks who are doing things that are very surprising, very creative, and very effective. Finland has been leading all the traditional things forever. But what's Finland actually doing right now? When you're kind of leading the world, you could just pat yourself on the back and say, we'll just continue doing what we're doing. But they see all the things Annie's just mentioned. So they are now turning their curriculum and the teacher training into basically creative problem solving, where it's not going to be discipline by discipline, 10 o'clock math, 11 o'clock English, et cetera, et cetera. They are basically doing project work where groups of students take on something like climate change, and they take the disciplines off the shelf and they learn from the various social and basic and hard sciences the different aspects of trying to solve a problem like that. And that's transdisciplinary. If you look at our universities and you look at the way we teach at all levels, we suffer from what I call hardening of the categories, and never the brain shall meet. And multidisciplinary doesn't cut it, because that means we ask students to build these kind of bridges. So we need a major reform in how we deliver on creative problem solving, because as Annie suggested, that's our future. We can't solve any social or economic problem with a single discipline. We need to create something larger than some of the parts with the use of all disciplines coming together.
Sue Winton?
I think I'll just end by just reiterating that I think that I do agree that, you know, it depends who are we comparing ourselves to? I mean, but what I would like to focus on is the point that with what we need to keep our eye on is the level of social inequality in our country. And the more we can reduce the amount of social inequality, I think the more progress that we can make on all kinds of indicators. And so that's what and that goes beyond education, but that's what I would like to emphasize. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. I wanted to bring that up because it's going to be perhaps a more competitive world than we've been used to when we come out of the COVID. The world's going to be in great turmoil. We're going to need all the skill, all the mental health, and all the energy we can possibly get in this educational field. I'm afraid that is all the time we have for questions tonight. It's been tremendously interesting, and I would like to thank the three guests, Charles, Pascal, Sue Winton, and Annie Kidder. So please do join us. If they're still there, please join us, please, on October the 20th, when we focus on the outdoor school, how we can use it and where we go from here. Very nice seeing you, and good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.